And then they look at him. It was incredible. Yeah. Some Vietnam creates desert storm first match. I was qualified. They all clap when you take to the terminal down. Sure. It's right. Yeah, right. Dr. John Cooper, he was part of the crew section. Right, yeah, Ron. What was the other guy, Tom? No, it's his wife, right? It's Dr. John's wife. Tom sort of gets by himself. I got still that thing hanging on my desk. One guy in the terminal was on his laptop when they was up like this. Everybody else stood up. They brought the fire trucks out, showered the plane. Too much trouble in the bus, so they had to stop. We went around White House. Was it local lights? Was it law enforcement? Excellent. It's a good talk, yeah. I guess so.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? We have the that's okay. Can you hear me better? Probably not. Okay. So we have a special treat for you today. And my name is Kevin Millington. I'm happy to be a volunteer here. And we have a very special guest speaker.
Is that working?
No.
Okay. Frank.
Hang on a second. Technical difficulties. I want to make sure you hear me okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the mic.
Power
Turn it on.
No.
You're on.
Am I on now? Oh, much better. See, Frank worked his magic. Well, thank you very much for coming. And as part of our monthly breakfast, we like to have a speaker when we can. And today we're very fortunate to have an excellent presentation. I know you're going to enjoy. And I'm happy to introduce Donna Esposito. And Donna has done a wonderful job here of organizing our collections and our research and library center, which if you've never seen, you really should. But she's really done a wonderful job, and thank you, Donna. In addition, Donna has a great interest in World War II aviation, particularly in the Pacific. And with a group, Pacific Wrecks, Donna just got back, I think it's your second tour of duty in New Guinea.
First time in New Guinea. So
Oh, okay.
Third time in
Bougainville, I think you...
Yes.
Okay, good. And she's going to give you a presentation on her trip. And on a sadder note for us, Donna is leaving shortly, I think later this month or next week, to take a position with professional position with Pacific Wrecks. And then before Donna's presentation, I do want to acknowledge a special guest in the audience, one of our founders, Sid Brown. Sid, are you here?
Yes.
Oh, welcome, Sid. So I'm happy to introduce Donna Esposito. Donna, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, hopefully this will all work. Can everybody hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for coming today, and thank you for supporting ESAM. These monthly breakfasts are one of our major fundraisers. We're an all-volunteer organization, and you coming out and having breakfast really makes a big difference for us to be able to put on the programs and make new exhibits and do all the outreach events that we do. So thank you. And I want to start off by thanking everybody at ESAM for giving me the opportunity to be a part of the team for the past 2 years. It's been an incredible experience. I've absolutely loved being part of the curatorial and acquisitions team and the library, the research center team. It's been wonderful. I'm going to miss everybody very, very much, but hopefully we'll be able to stay in touch, and we'll certainly love to come back and hopefully tell you about more trips. So today, maybe if it's not too much of a problem for people who are still finishing up breakfast, we could just turn out the lights, at least the ones closer to the front. Thank you. Maybe. How's that? Is that okay? All right, wonderful. Thank you. So today I'm going to be telling you about a trip that I just returned from, a 5-week trip to Papua New Guinea as part of the nonprofit organization Pacific Wrecks. And I'll just also start off with another acknowledgement. I want to thank Mr. Richard Portillo and Professor Andy Giles for providing the funding and a great deal of support for me to be part of this trip. So I just want to thank especially Mr. Richard Portillo. That will be the part of the trip specifically that Mr. Portillo and Andy were involved in will be a story for another day. But today I'm going to tell you a bit about one aspect of our trip to New Guinea. So, Pacific Wrecks, let me start off by telling you a little bit about the organization. And Pacific Wrecks is a nonprofit charity founded in New York by very local connection, RPI graduate Justin Talon. And in fact, when Justin was as a student at RPI, he did visit ESAM quite a few years ago, and was lucky to have him back a few months later. And thank John Panoski for giving us a great inside view of our model of the aircraft carrier Akagi. So Pacific Wrecks does have a very local connection here to ESAM. So the mission of the organization is to locate and document missing in action MIA service personnel, as well as to research and share information on past conflicts, especially World War II in the Pacific Theater, as you probably guessed by the name. And also preserve and protect remaining sites for future generations. So, whoops. There we go. So let me tell you about how we achieve those missions, and by a few different types of activities. First, some of you may be familiar with the website pacificwrecks.com. I had used that website for many, many years before I became associated with the organization, and I think it's the premier site for information about World War II and the Pacific Theater. So if that's ever been something, if you've ever Googled something about World War II and the Pacific, you've probably come up with a Pacific Wrecks page as one of your top hits. And so we also perform historical research using archival records and primary documents and add to the growing body of knowledge about the war in the Pacific. We also conduct and collect and preserve veterans' oral histories. Of course, as we unfortunately lose our World War II veterans, this is becoming increasingly important part of the mission to try to talk to as many as we can while we still have the chance. And we also have extensive library and archival collections. And I'm very excited that I'm going to be working with that aspect of Pacific Wrecks. and to work to make them accessible to the public. And we also do field expeditions to locate and document World War II sites, especially aircraft wreckages, to locate missing in action service personnel, and to promote the preservation of these historic sites for future scholarly study and future benefit to the many people with interest in the Pacific War. And so, as fascinating as library research is, and as much as I love looking at archival documents, that won't make as interesting a presentation as telling you about an expedition to the jungles of Papua New Guinea. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So just a little bit of a geography lesson for us this morning to get us oriented. Here's a map of the Pacific Theater from World War II. So to orient us, of course, here's China. Australia is way down here. Hawaiian Islands over here. And so this is the battlegrounds of the Pacific Theater, and particularly I'm going to be talking about way down here, Papua New Guinea and the Northern Solomon Islands. So you can see quite close to Australia, quite close to the equator, and quite far away from the homes of most of the young men and women serving in that area. So here's a close-up of the region that we visited on this last trip. Here's Papua New Guinea, the main island, the capital of the country. Port Moresby is over here. Several other islands, quite a few other islands are part of the country. New Britain Island. If you're an enthusiast of World War II, you've probably heard of Rabaul, which is located on New Britain over here. It's a major Japanese base that I'll tell you a bit more about. Another island here, New Ireland, also Japanese occupied during the war. And then here's Bougainville Island, technically, geographically part of the Solomon Islands, but now part of Papua New Guinea and perhaps soon to be an independent state. And I'll just point out the Solomon Islands Guadalcanal is down here. And this channel between the islands was known during the war as the slot. And pilots would fly up the slot to have air raids on Japanese bases. Ships would come down, and it was a major point of action throughout the war in the Pacific. So I'll just tell you very briefly about our trip geographically. I flew into Port Moresby, then flew from there to Rabaul. From Rabaul, boarded a boat and sailed down around between New Britain and New Ireland, around the southern tip, and spent some time on New Ireland, and then sailed to Buka and traveled to the southern part of Bougainville, then sailed back and actually stopped at Green Island, and then finally returned back to home port on New Britain. So I'll focus on just a couple wreckages that we saw and tell you their stories. So I'll also give you a bit of background information on Rabaul, just because it was such an important base and it figures in prominently in the rest of the story. And so this is on the island of New Britain. It was a Japanese Army and Navy headquarters in the South Pacific. It was occupied by Japan for essentially the entire war. There are multiple airfields, and it was never captured. It was bypassed, and resupply was prevented, and it was subjected to almost daily air raids. And it was also notable because it was the site of many Allied prisoners of war were held there, and unfortunately, many of them died there as well. So let me tell you about how our expedition started, what drove us to go on this trip. And it was a mystery on the island of New Ireland. An unknown plane wreck was reported. So tell you, Captain Rod Pierce is an underwater explorer, and he's captain of the MV Barbarian II. And he's based in New Guinea, and he happened to visit the southeastern coast of New Ireland. And the local people there reported a plane wreck to him and invited he and his team to investigate the site. And so one of his friends and colleagues, Rob Rawlinson, was on the boat, went ashore and photographed the site and was able to verify that it was an American plane wreck. And so Rob sent those photos to Justin Talon, director of Pacific Wrecks, for identification. Looking at the photographs, he was able to identify the plane as an American B-24 bomber and probably an MIA site. So definitely something that was worth further investigation. So in case you're not a big airplane enthusiast, let me tell you a little bit about the B-24. It was made by the company Consolidated, and it was called the Liberator was its nickname. It was a 4-engine heavy bomber, and it has the distinction of being the most produced U.S. plane in World War II. More than 18,000 of them were produced. And in fact, you can see some shots here of the factory. It was produced in multiple factories, and at one point they were turning out a B-24 bomber just about every hour. So pretty astonishing. There are thousands and thousands of parts and components that make up this plane. You know, just taking a look at the cockpit, you can see it's an incredibly complicated aircraft with many thousands of parts. And many of those parts do include a part number that identifies them as part of a B-24. So that's useful for identifying something as a type of plane, but the real question is, which exact plane is this? And each plane would have been given 2 unique numbers that distinguish it from all others. One was a constructor number given to it by the manufacturer, Consolidated, and then when the planes were received, either by the Army Air Force or the Navy, or they would get another number, a serial number or bureau number that the service would use to keep track of that plane and its crew. So we headed to New Ireland to identify this B-24. So just to look at the map again, this is New Ireland. We went to the southern coast area. And we were taken there by Rod Pierce and his crew of the MV Barbarian. And you can see we had a beautiful scenery, sailed around here. This is New Ireland, absolutely gorgeous. It's really a paradise. And we came ashore. This is the exact spot we were coming ashore at. You can see it's really idyllic with beautiful white sandy beaches, palm trees, and very friendly local people who were happy to take us to the site. So I'm going to show you, if I can start it up here, a little bit of video from the site. So the wreckage turned out to be on a very, very steep incline. It was fairly close to the shore in a riverbed, and it was spread over a wide area. So we quickly left the beautiful, idyllic part of the beach and headed for something a little more rugged. So,
help him this money. Good boy. Good. You okay?
So a little embarrassing, but I'm not ashamed to admit I needed help. I was outfitted with the best hiking shoes and gear, and as you can see, I needed help from a local person who was wearing no shoes and was quite comfortable walking up this kind of terrain. So we were very, very lucky to have wonderful people in the village who were happy to take us to the site and show us what was there. And so we quickly found many large and small pieces. And our goal was to document each piece photographically by taking still photographs, video, and also GPS coordinates. And the other thing that was very important to us was to minimally disturb the site. Since it was an unknown plane, we had to presume that it is the site of missing in action personnel, and there could in fact be human remains associated with this site. And so keeping that in mind and knowing that a future team from the U.S. government might return to excavate and hopefully find human remains, it's of course always in our mind to be as careful as possible. And of course we wanted to identify the plane, which meant searching for the unique number that either Consolidated or the Army Air Force had given to the plane. And so just give you a few ideas of things we saw, everything from ammunition to pieces of perspex, the plexiglass from canopies, to the entire engines. And I could show you, we literally have thousands and thousands of pictures, but I quickly realized that pieces of rusting parts in the jungle are probably not as interesting unless you're right there. So I've just selected a couple different ones to show you. And so here you can see part of the wing with the star. And then here's Justin Talon taking some footage of engine oil cooler here. You can see maybe how deformed in shape that is. That's normally a circular part, and it's been quite crushed from the impact of the crash. Here I am holding another piece. It's part of a turret assembly and part of the track. And in fact, parts of that and many other parts were made by General Electric. And does anybody recognize what this part is? Exactly, it's a turbo supercharger, and those were developed by General Electric. So another Schenectady connection, very local connection. They were developed by GE by engineer Dr. Sanford Moss, who actually got his PhD at Cornell in 1903. This booklet and describing superchargers from GE is actually in our collection here at ESAM. It's over in the next building upstairs at the library, the research center. We have extensive archival holdings here, and they are open to the public. So if anybody wants to do research, just let us know, and we're very happy to share our collections. And so here's, in fact, the data plate from not the supercharger I just showed you, but one, I saw this data plate on a previous trip to Guadalcanal, and this was in a museum there, and it was kind of fun to be so far away from home and see this data plate saying Schenectady, New York. So General Electric and right here played obviously a huge part in supplying everything imaginable for these planes, heavily involved in manufacture of aircraft, as well as many other things such as tanks. And so we've got a lot of World War II history right here, very locally. So we looked at every piece quite meticulously. And I'll show you a little clip of how the plane was actually identified. And I'm pretty excited to say I was the one who spotted the unique number on the plane. And I attribute this to the fact that I was going so slowly because it was such a difficult climb. So I think that kind of paid off. So I'll play you a little bit here about finding that number.
Okay, rolling, guys. What you saw over here.
Well, I was coming up this very steep terrain very slowly, looking carefully, and noticed some stenciling right on the inside here. Can you explain what this piece is that we're looking at?
This is the rear of the engine itself. Up there you can see the supercharger. the rear of the cowling. This is probably the number 2 engine on the B-24, the inboard engine on the left wing. It's upside down. So Donna's noticed something inside the structure here. Piece of probably the main spar of the wing. And amazingly, there's numbers and B-24D. Obviously a B-24D model is the aircraft type Liberator. But what's really intriguing is the 3 digits that are next to it. What are those numbers?
It's 982.
Now, we'll have to verify this when we get back to the vessel and have our references, but that is probably the 3-digit constructor number for Consolidated. It's not a U.S. Army Air Force serial number, but that number will correlate to the serial number, hopefully. And if so, we have the identity of this plane. This is a major component of the aircraft. This is the rear of the main spar. There's no doubt that that is the identity of the entire plane. Now, we're not going to stop here. We're not going to go back and celebrate. We're going to keep going, try to see everything, and ideally find that same number on another piece of wreckage. If we see that same 982 on another major component, or of course the tail serial number as a different number, those will be 2 points of identification to make up a definitive ID. But I don't think there's any chance that this could have been a swapped out part. This is the aircraft's potentially constructed on the 982.
So we just to show you what that looked like, the stenciling was inside there, and so it said B-24D 982, and it also had consolidated stamp indicating it was built at the San Diego facility. So in the end, we didn't find any additional numbers on the plane. In fact, we never located the tail of the plane, which would have been useful as it would have potentially had the Army Air Force number on the plane. So, so we wanted to know, of course, what plane is 982? What does that correspond to? And what happened to the crew that was aboard this plane? And so here's a little more of a close-up. You can see that stenciled number. So then we began what turned out to be a more difficult part of the process than slogging through the jungle, was getting information without the use of high-speed internet. And working with the resources we had and limited internet connections, we were able to do some research and identified this plane. And so Consolidated's plane 982 is U.S. Army Air Force plane 41-24186. And it's actually one off from what we expected the serial number to be. We expected it to be 187, but that plane was not lost in combat, and in fact wasn't even in the right location to be the plane we saw on New Ireland. So looking at 982, we saw that was the correct plane, and either the spars may have been swapped in the manufacture process, or the plane's numbers were just reversed when the Army Air Force recorded them. So this plane was assigned to the 13th Air Force, the 5th Bombardment Group, and the Headquarters Squadron. And this plane was known to her crew as Pretty Prairie Special. And you can see a few pictures of the plane down here, an earlier one, and kind of a rare color picture is really nice. Pretty Prairie Special, you see it as a very wholesome sunflower on it, not the typical nose art photo of an alluring young woman. And this photo also shows the 5th Bombardment Group's kind of mascot here of a skull with wings. And you see these are bombs here, one for each mission. We see 21. So some more information about Pretty Prairie Special. It was flown by Colonel Marion D. Unruh of the 5th Bombardment Squadron. He was actually the commanding officer of the squadron. So a very high-ranking officer was the pilot of this plane. And he named this plane after his hometown of Pretty Prairie, Kansas. So certainly sounds like an idyllic place full of fields and sunflowers, and I'm sure the thought of this plane and its name, reminded him of home. So the crew flew from Kearney Field on Guadalcanal and later from Munda Airfield on New Georgia, which is another island in the Solomons a little bit further north. We know they completed at least 21 missions, and we know that their last mission was on December 30th, 1943. And here's a photograph of the crew as well as Colonel Unruh here in front of the plane. So, Pretty Prairie's last mission. December 30th, 1943, they took off from Munda Airfield to bomb Rabaul. And they were intercepted by fighters, but they were able to bomb the target, bombed Rabaul, and proceeded home. But they had suffered some damage. So whatever hits they'd received prevented the bomb bay doors from closing after they dropped the bombs. And then other pilots and crew members on different planes who were part of this bombing mission had observed some explosions aboard Pretty Prairie. And then the plane was seen going into the clouds. It was last seen over the southern tip of New Ireland. And so here is a map. This is Rabaul, where the bombing mission took place. This circle is where they were last seen by the other planes in their squadron. And they disappeared. So what happened to Pretty Prairie? Well, it turns out that they didn't exactly disappear. And of course, with this plane being flown by the commanding officer of the whole bomb group, they wanted to find the plane and its crew. And so the very next day, 5 B-24s who had been on the raid the day before with Pretty Prairie went out to look for the plane and see if they could find it and hopefully find survivors. And in fact, they did. They flew back, and I'll show you, they flew back along the route and over the southern part of New Ireland on the eastern coast, saw people from the crew of Pretty Prairie. In fact, they observed 8 members of the crew assembled on the beach. So we can see, beautiful, pristine beach like we visited. So, of course, they were pretty excited to find their friends, dropped medical supplies, rations down to them, and that was about all they could do. Being another B-24, there was no means for them to land or somehow pick them up. So, of course, the next thing would have been to send a plane capable of fetching them, a Navy PBY Catalina. And that's an amphibious plane that would have been able to land in the water and collect the crew and take them home. Well, for some reason, that plane, that PBY, didn't come until January 3rd. And that's something we're still researching to try to understand the delay between December 31st and January 3rd. It seems weather may have been an issue. So for whatever reason, they did not make it back to rescue the crew for a couple days. When they got back, there was no trace of the crew. So what happened to the crew of Pretty Prairie? Well, it's a pretty sad story, one of, unfortunately, many similar sad stories from World War II. So there happened to be 11 men on the crew of Pretty Prairie that day, and 10 of them did not survive the war. So 2 of the men were actually, we think, drowned when the plane ditched. So what we found out is, based on the research and the photo I've just showed you, the crew bailed out of the plane. And so with the hope of surviving the crash. Unfortunately, 2 of them are believed to have drowned during the parachuting out process. And so these 2 men are still missing in action. Possibly in the water, possibly they landed on shore. It's not really known, but the surviving person, Colonel Unruh, believed that they had drowned during ditching. The other 9 people, including Colonel Unruh, were captured by the Japanese and became prisoners of war. 6 of them were and so they were taken to the island New Britain and held at Rabaul that I mentioned previously. 6 of them were believed to be executed, and some of their remains have since been recovered. And then 2 of them died as a prisoner of war at Rabaul. The conditions were there were appalling, and they died of disease or malnourishment. And so, in fact, of all the many prisoners that were held at Rabaul, only about 7 or 8 actually survived the war. So really horrendous experiences for the men that were held there. And the lucky people, like Colonel Unruh, were sent to prisoner of war camps in Japan. And that's what happened to Colonel Unruh, and that's, I'm sure, the reason he survived. Being a higher ranking officer, he was obviously much more important as a potential source of intelligence to the Japanese than sergeants or corporals in the crew. And so he did spend the rest of the war as a prisoner of war and did survive the war. So how do we know what actually happened? Well, we know about it from the accounts of the other pilots who were on the mission, who observed Pretty Prairie disappearing and going back to find her the next day. The Army Air Force had also intercepted interrogation reports for Colonel Unruh by the Japanese. So, of course, he was questioned to gather intelligence information by the Japanese, and those reports were intercepted. So it was known that he was, at least at that point, alive. Since he did survive the war, his firsthand account when he was finally liberated was, of course, the most important source. Japanese propaganda was actually another way that people knew what had happened to the crew of Pretty Prairie. Radio Tokyo and announced prisoners who had been captured, as well as their hometowns. This was information they would have gotten from their dog tags. And the Japan Times even printed an interview with Colonel Unruh, who, according to them, was very happy to be a guest of the Japanese. So I'm sure that's not quite the way it was. And importantly, we also know about it from the local residents of New Ireland. So I'll just point out this photo here of Colonel Unruh. He was still a prisoner when the war was over, and here's the commandant of the prisoner of war camp actually surrendering to Colonel Unruh as he was the ranking officer of the camp. So was surely a much anticipated day for him and the rest of the prisoners in that camp. Sadly, Colonel Unruh was actually killed some years later in an aircraft crash, piloting a plane, a home-built plane, a biplane that he built himself, which he actually had named Pretty Prairie as well. So very interesting story, and we're looking forward to talking to his surviving relatives as well as those of the other crew. So I'm going to tell you, as I said, one of the key things to kind of solving this mystery is the local residents of New Ireland. They were the people who had told Rod Pierce, captain of the ship, about the plane and took us to see it. And so this was in a village called Natar, where the plane wreck was. We visited them, had a wonderful ceremony to pay tribute to the men of Pretty Prairie Special. So you can see we're there with the flags of Papua New Guinea, the U.S., and the POW-MIA flag. And the people in the village are very protective of the site and the history surrounding it, and do have some oral history about 2 people coming down in parachutes. So we don't know. We think that's probably Colonel Unruh and one of the other crew. And so part of this process isn't just that we take photographs and leave and go on our way. It's also sharing this information to the local people. This is in their backyard. And so here's Justin Talon showing photographs of Pretty Prairie Special and the photos on the beach to some of the residents of Natar who helped us go to the plane. They very quickly told us that that photograph of the men on the beach was not their village. They said, oh, no, that's further down on the beach. You should go there. So we headed further south to the village of Bakhop. And it turns out that is where that photograph was taken. And just a couple of then and now. Here is the original photographs taken by the B-24 crews who came back to look for their friends. Here's an aerial view, drone footage of that same beach. And we felt that we wanted to stand there where those men were. So here's 8 of us on that beach, remembering them with the POW MIA flag, because all of those men either became POWs or there's still 2 MIAs associated with that plane. So what did we learn about Pretty Prairie Special from this expedition? Well, first we know that the account of the plane ditching in the water is incorrect. We know the crew did definitely bail out, but the plane continued to fly on a bit until crashing into the steep mountain on New Ireland. And so we believe there are no MIA remains associated with the wreckage. Based on Colonel Unruh's account, he believed everybody had parachuted out of the plane, but he did not necessarily witness that with his own eyes. At this point, we think that the 2 men who did not survive the bailing out process probably drowned in the water, but we're still investigating that. It's a possibility that they perhaps were elsewhere. So it's unlikely that the remains of those 2 men will ever be found, unfortunately, but it's still something that we are very much interested in. We will continue to do research, archival research, and to determine what else we can find about those 2 men and hopefully be able to share more information with their families. And quite importantly, now this crash site has been confirmed and identified, and we know now that it's not an MIA site with 10 or 11 people aboard. It's definitely what we would normally do is fully submit a report to the Department of Defense agency, DPAA, that handles this. And in fact, we have contacted them already about this plane. Had there been remains aboard, we'd be going down a little bit different process of making sure that the groups from DPAA knew precise information about that so that they could hopefully go back and collect those remains in a very timely manner to identify them and bring some closure to their families. So we now know that's not a site that's likely to be important to go back to. So I'm going to tell you about a couple other MIA cases that we were interested in. And the next island we went to is Bougainville, so northernmost geographically of the Solomon Islands. And Bougainville was a major Japanese base as well. It had many airfields, particularly Kieda and Kahili in the south. And it was occupied like Rabaul from early 1942 until the end of the war. Although the U.S. did invade in November 1943 over here at Cape Torokina, these airfields were still operational. And Bougainville is the site of many U.S. missing in action personnel. Some MIAs have been recovered, but there are many still missing. And in fact, the government agency, DPAA, does not currently perform missions to Bougainville. So I'm going to tell you about 2 in particular, one MIA who was found and one who's still missing. So the MIA who is no longer missing is a Corsair pilot named Charles. It was Lieutenant Charles Chuck Pillsbury. And he was a pilot of VF-17, a Navy squadron known as the Jolly Rogers. So a pretty famous squadron that probably, if you have an interest, have heard about. And he flew a Corsair with bureau number 17804. And he was lost on November 21st, 1943. He took off from Ondanga Airfield on New Georgia. That's one of the islands in the Solomon Islands, a little bit further north from Guadalcanal. And he was last seen over Buin, which is on southern Bougainville, on the Manoitu-Kahili Trail. And this was a Japanese road that was important for supplying their different bases. And the wreckage of his plane was found 25 years later in 1968. This Japanese road later became a road used by people today, the Kangoo-Buin Road. And his remains were discovered with the plane, and they were recovered and returned home to his home in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The wreckage of that Corsair is still in the jungle. So I'm going to tell you about that, but I'm also going to add, you might maybe kind of put two and two together. If you're familiar with Minneapolis, Minnesota, has the nickname of being the Mill City because of the flour mills there. So right away, my thought was, does this Pillsbury have anything to do with the Pillsbury that we all know about, Pillsbury baking? And in fact, yes. Charles Pillsbury was the grandson and namesake of Charles Alfred Pillsbury, who founded the Pillsbury Company that's now part of General Mills today. And so, a very patriotic family, very wealthy, but I'm sure they could have avoided sending any of their sons into the service. But in fact, 3 of the sons joined the service, Navy and Marine Corps, and another one was a civilian flight instructor. So really a family who did quite a lot for the war effort. And of course, the biggest sacrifice in losing their son, Charles. So I tell you this because the next time you go into the grocery store and every time thereafter and maybe grab your Pillsbury crescent rolls or something, think about Lieutenant Pillsbury being lost on a mission over Bougainville, and remember him. So let me tell you a little bit about the plane he was flying in case you're not a big warbird enthusiast. He was flying the Chance-Vought F-4U Corsair, which is really very kind of iconic single-engine fighter plane. It was flown widely by the Navy, the U.S. Marine Corps, as well as the Royal Navy and Royal New Zealand Air Force. It could be land or aircraft carrier base, and it was also built by Goodyear to keep up with demand, and not as well known, it was also built by the company Brewster as an F-3A in Long Island City, New York. And if you are a World War II aircraft enthusiast, you know that Brewster kind of has the distinction of not being a very good aircraft manufacturer and being responsible for the Brewster Buffalo and having some manufacturing problems. So not a lot of Brewster Corsairs, and I think only one in existence today is in the process of being restored. At least it was a few years ago. So, so there is actually a New York connection for us here at the Empire State Aerosciences Museum with the Corsair. So this Corsair Wreck, as I said, had been discovered since it was really not too far off of a widely used road in southern Bougainville. And it's been photographed many times over the years. It was found in 1968, was photographed by Jim Watts in 1972, and this photograph by David Holdsworth was published in 1984, although we think it actually predates this one. Seems to be in a little bit better condition. So we can see back then quite good shape. And we visited that site today. We happened to be very close by there and decided to go take a look, perform photographic documentation of the site, and really digitally preserve it at this point in time, as you know, it's always unknown what will happen to these sites, whether through action of people or less likely environmental damage, but most damage has been caused by people, unfortunately. So you can see today, looking at the same spot, large sections of the plain have been cut out, probably either for scrap metal or souvenir hunters, unfortunately. And you can see this would have been the armored plate behind the pilot's seat. Oops. Oops. And a couple more shots. So quite a bit of the plane still there. You can see the radial engine is actually still there. The tail of the plane as well, and quite a bit of the fuselage. Not really the forward cockpit, just in pieces. So this was a lethal and fiery plane crash. And just a couple of pictures here. You can see the wing here. It's got the really iconic inverted gull-shaped wing that the Corsair is kind of known for. And so here's a photograph of what it looked like in the South Pacific, and this isn't the exact plane, but very similar. And you can see that in the jungle today. So really, they've you can definitely identify them fairly easily as far as type of plane. This plane, since it had been previously identified as far as specific bureau number, we didn't look for that information since we did know what plane it was. So I'll tell you about another pilot who was also missing in action in the same area. And unfortunately not as lucky as Lieutenant Mancini, because he is still missing in action. And so this man is named Lieutenant John A. Mancini, and he was a pilot in the 17th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron. And he flew an unarmed version of a P-38 Lightning, which was another type of fighter plane, a twin-engine fighter plane. And the version he flew is called an F-5, and instead of guns, it had cameras. So he was flying completely unarmed, and as were the rest of the people in his squadron. They would make these photo reconnaissance flights to take pictures that would then be analyzed and used to determine future bombing targets. So a very dangerous role that I think that doesn't get a lot of talking about. We all know about the famous fighter pilots, but not too many people think about these guys who are flying the same planes but didn't have any guns to defend them. And of course they did meet up with the Japanese as well, and had to hope they could outmaneuver them. So John Mancini was lost on April 22nd, 1943. And he was last seen taking off from Guadalcanal, the Fighter II, or Kukum as it was also known, for a photo reconnaissance mission against Kahili and the Shortlands. And Kahili was the Japanese airfield on the southern coast of Bougainville, very, very close by the wreckage of Lieutenant Pillsbury's plane. And he was seen taking off, and he was never seen again. So he is still missing in action, and his remains have never been located. So he technically could be anywhere between Guadalcanal and Bougainville. So we don't know if he made it to his target, was shot down near there, or if something had happened before that or on the way home. So why am I telling you about Lieutenant John Mancini? Well, because he's from Ballston Lake, so just a few miles away from here. And he attended Siena College. And in fact, here's a newspaper article from Siena, from the Siena News. This is the future Lieutenant Mancini was in the flying club at Siena College. So he was known for being kind of a character. He drove a 1927 Model T that it was kind of famous for that. And so must have been quite a guy between his car and his flying exploits at school. And so here's a picture of him after joining up. He, let's see, I'm not sure exactly where this picture was taken, but very striking. Could be in Hawaii, or it could have actually been on Guadalcanal. Have to ask his family for more information if they know. And so he was lost on April 22nd. And so April 22nd, 1943, well, was 75 years ago. So it just happened that we were in the southern Bougainville area on April 22nd of this past year, the 75th anniversary of his loss. And we were very honored to think about him and pay respects to him. We've been very lucky to meet his nephew and his great-nephew, who are actually both pilots. His nephew is a friend of ESAM's own John Panoski, and who put me in touch with him. And so we're grateful to the Mancini family for sharing information about their uncle with us. And so, you know, we felt very, very fortunate to be in the area and think about his sacrifice on that day. So Lieutenant Mancini is still missing in action, and he's actually one of about 5,870 MIAs from New York from World War II who are missing in action. And New York actually has the distinction of is the state with the most missing in action servicemen from World War II. And most of those MIAs are in the Pacific theater, not Europe. And so it's just something that we think about a lot. Being from New York, Justin Talon, as I said, RPI graduate, he's from New York, from Hyde Park, New York. And so New York missing in action servicemen is especially a topic close to our heart, and a goal for Pacific Wrecks, of course, is to bring these men home. And so we remain committed to looking for MIAs, and hopefully in maybe our future expeditions, we will find some trace of Lieutenant Mancini. It's a long shot, but it's certainly a goal of ours to keep doing this work, and we're very, very honored to be able to participate in that process. And so I'll just leave you with a couple acknowledgments again. I do want to thank, again, Mr. Richard Portillo, who provided the funding for me to be able to participate in this expedition. Also, Professor Anderson Giles, who was involved in getting me in a related project that led to this trip, which I'll save for another time, but a very interesting story about a discovery that he made on southern Bougainville at the crash site of Admiral Yamamoto's Betty. So that's a topic for a different talk, which hopefully I'll be able to come back another time and share with you. I also want to thank Rod Pierce, captain of the MV Barbarian II, and the great crew, Rob Rawlinson, Shane Woodgate, Dorothy and Rebecca, who took good care of us on the trip. The people of New Ireland and Bougainville, who are extremely friendly, warm, and welcoming. Without them, we could not have made it to any of these sites. So we're very, very grateful that the people who live in these places, who live and see these wreckages on a daily basis in some cases, understand the importance of them to history, and also the importance of them to individual American families back home. So they understand that these sites could be missing in action sites, that they're basically graves, and they treat them as such, and are usually extremely happy to help with whatever research and is needed at the site to help identify it and then bring remains home. So we're very, very grateful to the communities of these places. Of course, I want to thank Justin Talon, Director of Pacific Wrecks, for getting me involved in the project, and still kind of unbelievable. It's only seeing these photos that I'm in, I think, was I really there in the jungle? So it's kind of amazing. I want to thank Steve Kleiman, a volunteer with Pacific Wrecks, who took a lot of the still and video footage for us, as well as Edward Rogers, another Pacific Wrecks historian who does, as well as field work, does extensive archival research. So we depended on him quite a lot, especially when we had very limited internet. Point out a couple references that, of course, we use and people might find interesting. Well, the Pacific Wrecks website, we aim to curate as much information as we can and get it all in one spot. B-24 Best Web has a lot of great information about B-24, so it has some great pictures of pretty Prairie. A book, Scootin' Thunder by Beth Hauser. Her father was another B-24 pilot on that same mission and provided a lot of information about what happened to the crew. And David Holdsworth, whose book, Papua New Guinea Battlefields, contained photographs of Lieutenant Pillsbury's plane. So I want to acknowledge all of these people, and I want to thank you for your attention and really appreciate you coming out today and let me tell the story. I'm very, very excited to be able to tell you about this and hope to be able to come back in the future, tell you more about Pacific Wrecks. I'll just say again, we are a nonprofit charity, and the work that I've described to you today is supported by donations. So we're really grateful as well to our donors who've made this possible. So I'll be happy to take any questions, and I want to thank you, and I'm going to just leave you with a little bit of very gorgeous drone video of the village of Backup Village on New Ireland. It's not as smooth because my computer so high quality, my computer can't quite keep up with it. But as you can see, it's a very, very beautiful place. And for me, very sobering to think about the tragedy that happened in such a beautiful place, and important that we remember the men and women who made, in many cases, the ultimate sacrifice for us so far from home. So thank you so much for coming today and supporting the museum, and thanks for listening. And I'd be happy if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Are you ever able to cross-reference with Japanese references?
Yes. Actually, that's an excellent question. And yes, in fact, that has been very crucial in solving a lot of kind of mysteries. And so Justin Talon, as well as his colleagues in Japan, do regularly utilize Japanese records. That's something I personally haven't been able to get into yet, but I'm very excited to start doing that. And so they, of course, kept meticulous records. And it's very interesting to compare the U.S. side of a mission and the Japanese side, and see what matches, what doesn't match. Sometimes, the Americans claim we shot down 10 zeros, and the Japanese said we lost 2 zeros, and vice versa. But it's also extremely important for potentially understanding what happened to crews that bailed out or became MIA or are POWs. So yes, Japanese records are very, very useful, especially in hopefully finding what the fates were of some POWs and MIAs. So a very good resource that I think maybe a lot of other groups kind of don't delve into that side of it. Larry.
So it might be a related question. So is that how you know the fate of those on the B-24 when you had all those crew members that were captured and then later killed? Is that how they know that?
Yes. So some of it came from what Colonel Unruh had observed, but obviously not. He didn't know about the fates of the POWs, and that does come from Japanese records. Of course, this comes from our first line of information is usually a missing aircrew report, which I know you're very familiar with these, based on your research for your uncle. So when there was a plane crash or a missing air crew, the Army Air Force would produce a missing air crew report that would summarize everything they knew at the time about the loss, the names of all the crewmen, information about the plane, testimony by other pilots who might have witnessed something. And so if there have been any intercepted Japanese communications, that would get incorporated into a missing aircrew report as well. And then another file called an individual deceased personnel file. Unfortunately, when it was determined that somebody was MIA, was not going to be found alive, this file was created to, again, summarize everything known about the case. And so we did just get individual deceased personnel files from at least one of the crewmen who was missing in action, and we're able to see some Japanese information in there as well. So after the war, a great deal of effort was put into researching and compiling as much information from Japanese records as well. So sometimes the information is in American documents, and in some cases it does involve going back to Japanese documents that haven't been fully utilized as well.
Do you have an idea how many wrecks are out there in that theater you're talking about? Just, is it a 10, 100?
It's
that are unknown.
I would guess easily hundreds, but perhaps thousands. And of course, a lot of times, as with the case of Lieutenant Mancini, we don't know if his wreck is in the water. We don't know if his wreck is on land. So there are, between all of the different types of planes that were flying out there, I would estimate thousands. Probably Justin probably could tell you like a precise number. So I'll have to ask him for that. But he's probably typing it in right now if he's watching this. But it's a huge number, and obviously it's 75 years has gone by, and we're still doing this work. The U.S. government has been looking for MIAs consistently since the end of the war, and it's a huge job, and so much so that private nonprofit organizations like Pacific Recs and several others are also engaged in that process, because there's just too many people left to find, and as I also mentioned, not everybody goes everywhere. So for instance, Bougainville was considered too dangerous a place to go to. So currently, the U.S. government doesn't go to Bougainville to recover MIAs, but we're very happy to go there. And in fact, one of the best parts of this trip, as I mentioned, the local people are just fountains of information and very happy to share this because they know how important this is. We received many different leads that are potentially American MIA planes. So we're already getting pretty excited about when we can get back and start looking at these other planes that have never been investigated. Yes?
I noticed that you're primarily in the Pacific area. Is there anything in the European theater?
Well, there certainly are still many MIAs, many even aircraft wreckages in the European theater, but a lot fewer just because of the size of the area and the population density. Of course, those tended to be found much sooner, but that's still ongoing. We don't really work in the European theater, but other groups as well as the U.S. government does, and have made, even just this year, identifications of pilots from the European theater. So it's really an ongoing mission, and of course time sensitive, as now unfortunately a lot of times there isn't a family member alive who remembers the person who's been lost, but of course in many cases they still have a large connection to their family, even if it's just by stories passed down from other relatives.
Do you do water as well as land wrecks?
Yes, yes,
is there a distinction to be made?
Well, so we do. I'm only land-based, although I've been urged to learn to scuba dive, so we'll see. But yes, so the group does do diving, and Rod Pierce, who is the captain of the ship that we were on, has been responsible for finding many underwater plane and shipwrecks as well. And so, so yes, and of course, many planes are lost in the water. It, you know, in some ways can make it a lot harder to find. In other ways, they may be better preserved, but it's depending on the conditions can be harder to find. But it is something, and that was kind of another facet of the trip that I didn't really mention, is while we were hiking around through the jungle back on the boat, they were doing side scan sonar to look at the bottom of the water and see what was there, and look for wrecks there as well. So definitely another part of the mission. And, all right, is that anything else? All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Oh, thank you.
That was a wonderful talk. And before you go, I think a lot of the planes that Donna was pointing out, we have right here.
That's right.
I
Let's.
think this fellow right here is under a F4U Corsair. Looks like it's on a strafing run.
That's right.
P-38. And one of my favorite times here with Donna was, I think it was about 6 months ago. I happened to be here during the day, and Donna was working with Larry MacArthur and Bob Ford. I think we're looking for a B-24 door, which we just happened to have.
Yeah,
and Donna
we
took me out
did.
to, remember, you took me out to the scary little building out in the back there. And it was right there. You know, we just happened to have a B-24. But thank you very much, Donna.
Oh, well,
really,
thank you.
really made a tremendous difference.
Oh,
in the
thank you.
museum.
Well, oh, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it.
Hope our
It's
paths
been,
cross.
oh, absolutely.
On behalf
Absolutely.
of the trustees and everyone here,
Oh,
thank you very much, Donna.
Thank you. Well, it's been wonderful.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
coming.
Kevin. Thank you. Not bad. Oh, thank you. Okay.
You have to have another picture book to sell it. I'm sure somebody buys it.
I bet. Okay, we're broadcasting this live, so I will turn this off. I'm just going to sneak back there.
No, let me just think about it. Nice try. Where are you moving to? You tried California, but you never made it. Good. You have to read her book.
I know, actually.
I'm not necessarily American.
I just want to thank you so much for what you guys do.
Oh, thank you. I'll just